Good morning, boys and girls. So today we're going to be talking about our Piedmont Indians. And again, just like we did yesterday with our Tuscarora, we are going to be focusing on one individual group more so than the others. We are still going to be talking about all the different tribes that were found in the Piedmont years ago. But again, we're going to focus on one specific one. So we're going to talk about Piedmont Indians, and then today's date is going to be 10/27/20, or if you want to write October 27th, that is fine as well. Now, before we get going into the actual Indians, the tribes of the Indians, there's some interesting information that I want you also to know about the Piedmont region as well. Long ago, in like the 1450s, that's when they can date it back to, is when one of the earliest known groups of people lived in the Piedmont. So again, we talked about the early Native Americans coming over on that land bridge up by Alaska and Siberia. And when they came over, they slowly but surely made their way down to the Piedmont. So they have found artifacts that they can date back to the 1450s, but nothing sooner than that. The people that lived here, the earlier people, they were called mound builders. And the reason for that is because they built flat-topped mounds, and the mounds were just large hills of dirt. Now, upon further exploration of these mounds, of what was there from these early people, they found relics inside, again, other artifacts inside. So they know that these mounds were used for two things. They were used as temples and also burial places. Okay, so they were used as temples and then also where they buried people. So kind of like how in Egypt they have the pyramids, the early people used mounds and then would bury their people underneath those. Okay, so that's just some interesting information because again, that's 1450s, so that's quite a few years ago. And then right behind that were when explorers started coming. We know that in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So when he comes over, the explorers come over, that's when they find the other tribes that we're going to be talking about now. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and move down, and we're going to start talking about our tribes today. So most tribes in the Piedmont area, not all of them, but most tribes, spoke the Siouan language. They spoke that Siouan language. The top four most well-known tribes is the Catawba, Okaniki, Tutelo, and Waxhaw. Those are the top, the top four tribes we know about that lived in the Piedmont. The Catawba tribe is the one that we're going to focus the most on today. They were the most prominent group. They were the biggest group, but we'll get into that in just a little bit as well. Okay, so some interesting things to know about the Piedmont tribes. They did live in two different places, just depending on the year. I'm going to go ahead and write that information over here just to save some room on the bottom. In the winter months, they had hunting camps in the forest. And then in the summer, the spring and summer as well, they'd start moving back in the spring. They built their villages along rivers and streams. And the main reason that they did that, boys and girls, was for farming purposes. in order to help those crops grow that they planted. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and also just draw a box around that to know that this is some separate information. But again, they were known to migrate to different locations within the Piedmont. They wouldn't leave the state, but they were known to migrate within the state, just depending on the seasons, the temperature, and what resources were available to them at the time. Another thing about just all the Piedmont Indians that's important to know is that they built round houses called wigwams. Wigwams were constructed and built the same way that the longhouses were, but they were just more in that rounder shape than in a long rectangular shape. Alrighty, boys and girls, so now we're gonna go ahead and focus on just that Catawba tribe. So I'm gonna move this down. And again, at any point, if you need to pause this video to catch up on notes, please do so. And please also make sure that you are paying attention, because we're gonna talk about some things that aren't necessarily written, but you will need to know them, okay? The Catawba people have been come to known as the river people because they built, the majority of their tribes were built, their villages were built by rivers. There is a Catawba River, which kind of borders the Piedmont and the mountain region. And the Catawba River also goes from North Carolina into South Carolina as well. That is where a lot of these tribes, the Catawba tribes, were located, was on this main river. It's a very big river, so there was a lot of resources for them to share. As of right now, there are no Catawba Indians still living in North Carolina. There are still some living in South Carolina. So unlike the Tuscarora, where we still have some living in northern North Carolina, there are no Catawba tribes right now in North Carolina. They're all in South Carolina. They migrated a little bit more south when the settlers came in. With the Catawba, they were known for building, so they built large meeting houses. And these meeting houses were at the center of the village, and they were used for government purposes, okay? And within these meeting houses, we're gonna take some notes about the meeting houses, what would happen in there. The entire village gathered here to discuss problems. So everyone was heard within the villages. It wasn't just the men. It was majority of the men, but it wasn't just the men. Women were also invited to come to these discussions as well, just to talk about the problems and talk about possible solutions. Now, they kind of formed the same type of government that we have today, which is a democracy. Which is a government where people have a voice in making decisions. Ultimately, yes, we do have some higher people that ultimately make the final decisions, but that was the same way that the Catawba was as well. So the Catawba had leaders and also advisors, and these were the ones that made the final decisions on what to do, how to fix the problems, how to change the problems to make them better. So advisors are just people who give advice to the leaders of the tribes. They were still known mainly as chiefs of the tribe, but some did not take on that role. And then again, just because we talked about it, I want to make sure that we understand what it is, because this is going to come back later in the year, boys and girls. Again, a democracy, again, is a type of government, but it's this form of government specifically as a government in which the people have a voice in making decisions. So one thing that's really popular here in North Carolina still, there are still times where some cities, some towns will have town meetings, and they'll have people come from that neighborhood, from those cities and towns, to discuss problems that they need to have fixed. And then they'll take a vote on it. So even right now, with voting season going on, we are voting right now to make some decisions for our country. So we are given a choice and a chance to go out and vote to make those changes. Whether people do that or not, that is their own choice. But there are some places that are not democracy. There are some countries that is more like a dictatorship, where there's one person in charge and he's basically like, this is my way or no way. But we'll get into that more as we get into social studies, talking about North Carolina, but also talking about the world, who's influenced us as the year goes on. Alrighty, boys and girls, please make sure you have these notes written down, and then your assignment is waiting for you under assignments.